Good morning, and thanks Ed and your staff members, Shane, Katrina, and Debbie, for putting on this workshop and taking care of all the logistics to make it happen. Also, thanks to those who are attending for spending the day participating in the workshop. So my follow-up talk to Kip's presentation focuses in on some of the issues that not only prompted the need for this USGS DRI groundwater model tool that Kip has described for the Humboldt River region, but also are issues that represent continuing challenges for the development of conjunctive management practices for the Humboldt River region, as well as for the state of Nevada. Hopefully these two presentations regarding issues on the Humboldt River watershed will provide a little bit of food for thought and maybe even some insight into how stakeholders, water users, and other agencies might need to or want to approach conjunctive management issues in their neck of the woods and across the state. So I've broken down this talk into two general sections. The first section will cover background information regarding how the issues on the Humboldt River watershed have prompted the need for conjunctive management. And the second section, which is really the bulk of this talk, will take a dive into the challenges, practices, and potential implications that face conjunctive management both in the Humboldt River region, but perhaps also across the state. So here's the crux of the problem in the Humboldt River region as it was recognized back in 2015. The Humboldt and its tributaries are fully appropriated and are entirely senior to the groundwater rights. During the 2012 to 2015 drought, the farmers in Lovelock didn't get their in-priority water and alleged that groundwater pumping was to blame. The state engineer recognized that the science indicates that groundwater pumping can capture Humboldt River water, and he also recognized that curtailment in the classic sense wouldn't really work. It indiscriminately harmed pumpers irrespective of whether they played a role in creating the conflict, and it frankly might require decades of curtailment for surface water flows to return to what I'd call pre-impacted flows. Furthermore, the data and tools were at that time just not available to quantify the magnitude and distribution of capture, and also to verify that conflict had occurred as a function of this capture. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about what administrative changes have occurred as a result of the Humboldt River region problem. Before 2015, the state engineer had managed surface water and groundwater as separate and distinct sources. And that meant that the potential for groundwater and surface water interaction was rarely considered from an administrative perspective, even though the science as far back as to the 1950s and probably earlier actually recognized that groundwater pumping could capture and potentially conflict with surface water use. In 2015, the state engineer was faced with the Humboldt River region problem and the recognition that the Nevada practices were out of sync with the science on groundwater-surface water interaction. So this recognition prompted our office to initiate contracts with the USGS and DRI to develop groundwater models for the Humboldt River region, and also to begin harmonizing the administrative practices with the science on surface water and groundwater interaction. On the administrative side, this translated into our office starting to evaluate new applications for groundwater rights with respect to whether they would impact surface water rights by capturing stream flow. It also prompted orders to install meters and upgrade head gates so that surface water and groundwater in the Humboldt River region could be more accurately measured. And in 2017, the legislature added language to the NRS recognizing conjunctive management for all sources of water. After that, in between 2017 and 2019, in an attempt to put some flesh on the bones of the conjunctive management statute, our office began to develop draft mitigation regulations and proposed further revisions to the NRS to support these regulations. These actions were focused on addressing potential conflict in the Humboldt River region. And although regulations were developed in coordination with the Humboldt River stakeholders, including surface water and groundwater farmers, ranchers, the mines, municipalities, the regulations and the statutes needed to enact the regulations essentially had no public support, and they failed to pass. Drilling a little deeper into the failed mitigation regulations, the general approach was to make conflicted surface water users whole using money. This would be done by measuring whether actual deliveries met or exceeded scheduled deliveries for the surface water users. If surface water users were shorted, basically a conflict, they'd be compensated according to the value of the water that they should have received. In order to compensate the surface water users, the groundwater users would share in the liability based on their proportion of the overall pumping-induced capture, and that would be derived from the groundwater models. This means that groundwater users next to the river who would capture more river water would have a greater liability and therefore pay a higher fee. Groundwater users would also have the option of avoiding payment by providing in-stream augmentation to offset their capture. Needless to say, this scheme was not met with overwhelming approval and was really fundamentally rejected by the Lovelock farmers on the grounds that their livelihood and community was rooted in irrigation farming, and they wanted water, not money. Okay, so that's pretty much where we stand with respect to the progress on the formal administrative side of conjunctive management in the Humboldt River region. Since mid-2019 and after these regulations failed, the state engineer is essentially elected to put the formal development of any long-term conjunctive management on hold until we get the results from the groundwater capture study. This decision kind of falls under the you can't manage what you don't measure category, and essentially comes from the need to better understand the magnitude of the problem and to be able to communicate those results to the surface water and groundwater users and other stakeholders so that they can also participate in finding practical solutions to the problem. I'll now shift gears again and talk a little bit about some of the challenges in developing effective conjunctive management practices for the Humboldt River region. The first challenge I'm going to talk about is quantifying the capture impacts from groundwater pumping. This is really mainly a technical challenge and the principal purpose for the USGS and DRI capture study and the groundwater models. It's time and work intensive, and data limitations used to develop and calibrate the model means that there's always going to be some level of uncertainty with regard to actually measuring capture impacts. There will likely be hurdles associated with concerns about the extent to which the capture model and the capture simulated within those models accurately reflect capture that occurs in the real world at individual wells across the region. The second challenge is simply measuring conflict. In the Humboldt River region, conflict really only occurs to surface water users when he doesn't get as much water as he was scheduled to get. Since scheduled deliveries are determined based on measured daily flow at the Palisade gauge on the river, we can know this in real time and on a daily basis. But we also need to know how much water is actually delivered to each surface water user. How do we actually accurately measure deliveries in a system with a wide range of unstructured diversion features that include natural flooding? If we can't physically measure conflict, or if we need to predict conflict to help avoid it, can we use the model to develop runoff scenarios that help predict when capture, as measured by the model, will result in a certain amount of conflict? These kind of questions are things we haven't fully answered yet and really need to rely on the results of the model to do so. The third challenge, and this is a tough one, is accounting for climate variability. The one place where we can get really good measurements of actual deliveries compared to scheduled deliveries is below the Rye Patch Dam and to the Lovelock farmers. This plot on the left shows the record for deliveries to Lovelock for the period since the system, the Humboldt River system, was adjudicated. It's fairly obvious that the 2012 to 2015 period stands out as a time when actual deliveries were substantially lower than what was scheduled to be delivered. On this plot, the 100% line means that what you got was equal to what you were scheduled to get. And if you're above that line, you got more than you were scheduled to get. And if you're below that line, you got less than what you were scheduled to get. And that would be a short or a conflict. But I want to point out that if you overlay this plot with Humboldt River flows, what you see is a correlation between percent allocation received and the amount of water in the river. So it becomes fairly obvious that the ability to deliver water is also affected by drought. This overlay shows that back in the 1950s, before any serious pumping was occurring, there were two periods where the Lovelock farmers were shorted, in this case by climate. So how do we resolve out the impacts from wet and dry cycles from the impacts of groundwater pumping? It's another challenge. The need for conjunctive management in the Humboldt River region originates from an imbalance really between supply and demand. And the only way to resolve this is either to increase supply or decrease demand. The availability of surplus water is limited to very wet years that occur maybe once or twice in a 10-year period. Is it even feasible to collect, store, and recover that excess water, the flood water, for later use? And how much would that kind of a solution cost, and who pays for that? Alternatively, if conjunctive management relies solely on reducing demand, then who's going to restrict their use, and to what extent will that restriction eliminate conflict? These questions are not yet resolved. Timing issues become a problem. There are timing issues between, the attempt to immediately prevent conflict, which occur, apparently during drought years, and long-term prevention of capture that suggests that management that only restricts pumping during dry years, for example, or curtailment efforts, simply won't solve the problem. So how do we deal with these challenges that are caused by this limited water resource? Another substantial challenge is the consensus building. How do we build consensus towards developing any kind of formal conjunctive management scheme where somebody is either going to have to pay money or likely restrict their use? How do we build consensus under these challenging circumstances? Currently, groundwater users tend not to believe that they're causing a problem at all, and surface water users may see this as a bigger problem than it really is. So how can we bring these groups together in order to come up with a mutually acceptable solution to the capture and conflict problem? So those are some of what I think are the major challenges that we face going forward with developing long-term conjunctive management practices for the Humboldt River region. So what are we doing now in this period before the completion of the capture studies and the development of formal conjunctive management strategies? Essentially, our short-term goal is to prevent additional capture impacts to the river, or what I'd call the do no more harm kind of strategy. And how are we doing this? Well, for any new application that comes into our office that's within 5 miles of the river system, including the tributaries, we conduct a streamflow depletion analysis where we determine how much capture would occur under the proposed application. And if that determination results in an increase in capture as defined by the accuracy of the method we use, then that application is not looked at as being favorable and would likely be denied. However, if the application is determined to cause no increase in capture, then it could be approved. We're also considering applications that could avoid conflict by offsetting their increase in capture using either replacement water or by relinquishing some groundwater rights to offset that increase in capture. And I'll describe not only the streamflow depletion analysis method, but also the potential tools that could use replacement water or relinquishment in the next few slides. This slide is intended to illustrate how we currently evaluate applications for streamflow depletion. We typically use an analytical tool called the Glover solution to predict capture. The analysis is based on a combination of the proposed well's distance from the river and on aquifer properties between the well and the river itself. Under typical aquifer conditions in the Humboldt River Basin, proposed wells within something like about 2 miles of the river can cause measurable capture after about 5 years. In the example I'm showing on the left here of a new well, a new appropriation, this proposed well is predicted to capture 50% of its water from the river after 5 years, and that's shown graphically on the curve at the bottom. Now, if the application is to change the point of diversion of an existing right to a location nearer to the river, we treat these a little bit differently. The determination here is based on whether that move causes a measurable increase in capture compared to where it previously existed. In the example on the right, the change illustrated would cause a notably smaller capture amount compared to a new appropriation because we're really looking at the increase in capture that's caused by the move. These two examples illustrate the relative difficulty to obtain a new appropriation within 1 or 2 miles of the river that doesn't capture water. And they also show that while a change to an existing permit is less problematic, any change that moves a well close to the river will likely cause increased capture. Recognizing the draconian implications that this practice of streamflow depletion analysis and frankly, denial of applications that cause increased capture can have on developing water resources, particularly groundwater resources in the Humboldt River. One of the tools that our office has been looking at is the use of decreed surface water to offset capture caused by the proposed application. So how would this work? I've shown an example up above, and it's kind of detailed, so I can't get into all of this with the time I have. But in this example, the proposed well is predicted to capture water based on the blue curve on the plot on the right. In this hypothetical case, the plot predicts capture that it increases up to something like 9 acre-feet after about 50 years of continuous pumping. And that's shown in the blue line. If the applicant were able to secure a decreed surface water right that has the appropriate seniority and the appropriate amount to be able to offset that capture, then conflict could be avoided and the groundwater application could be granted. In this illustration, the predicted deliveries from an 1870 right for about 0.045 CFS are shown in the orange bars on that plot, and these orange bars are estimated based on actual historical flow. And what they show is that overall the replacement water from that right would exceed the capture, but it also shows that there are several years where, due to drought, the replacement water simply wouldn't be served. So this illustration shows that while it's not a perfect solution, this replacement water tool may be a feasible option for avoiding conflict. Another tool for consideration is relinquishing water to offset increased capture from moving a well nearer to the river. So this really applies to a change app. In the above example, the proposed change is predicted to increase capture from the river, and this is illustrated in the plot shown on the right by the blue line that shows short-term increases in capture followed by a diminishing long-term capture. It's a 50-year plot, just like the previous one. In this case, if the applicant were to propose to move 10 acre-feet of water from the existing well into a proposed well and then relinquish something like 1.6 acre-feet of other water from the existing well, they could offset the increase in capture. Conflict would be avoided and this application could be granted. In this illustration, what you can see is that the predicted recovery in the river due to the relinquishment, which are shown in orange, show that in the first few years, capture actually wouldn't be offset, but over the long term, the recovered water caused by the relinquishment would actually exceed overall capture. Again, while it's not a perfect scheme, and particularly in the early years, relinquishment may also be a feasible option for avoiding additional conflict going forward. So these kinds of tools that I've described really only deal with new appropriations and change applications that would move a water right closer to a surface water feature. They wouldn't really help reduce or prevent potential conflict from capture impacts that are caused by historical pumping and existing water rights. Currently, and largely as a consequence of the lack of support for our 2019 mitigation regulations, the State Engineer's Office has taken the approach of holding off on defining specific long-term management practices until the modeling effort is complete and we have a better understanding of the magnitude and distribution of capture impacts to the Humboldt River and its tributaries. However, there are some suggestions out there that have merit and are worth thinking about, and I've listed several of those here. From my perspective, I think that the replacement water concept is one that has merit not only for new appropriations, but also to offset capture from existing pumping. In this case, existing groundwater users could avoid impacts to the river by securing and dedicating a surface water right to in-stream use in an amount sufficient to offset their conflict liability. I also think that using assessment fees that are prorated to a groundwater user's capture liability has merit. Not really for use as a payout to those who don't get their water, but maybe instead to go towards projects that would help eliminate conflict. Fees could be used to support an ASR project, perhaps the retirement of water rights, improvements to efficiencies of both surface water and groundwater use, essentially anything that would serve to either reduce demand or increase available supply of the water resource in the Humboldt River region. Also, I think that curtailment of groundwater users may ultimately be a necessary tool in circumstances where either curtailment is shown to be effective at increasing actual flow within the time frame of a potential conflict, or when curtailment is the only available tool to effectively relieve persistent conflict caused by cumulative impacts to capture over time. So I'm not going to talk about some of these other bullets that I have here in the interest of time, but I did want to list some of the ideas that have been proposed out there, both and thought about from our office as well as from the stakeholders too. Now for my last gear shift of the day, I'd like to talk a little bit about statewide implications. This map shows the watersheds that fall within the principal group where surface water and groundwater issues will likely play a principal role in management. They include the Truckee River, Carson River, Walker River, and the Muddy and Virgin Rivers to the south. On a more local scale, there are a good number of additional streams that are also connected to an aquifer like the Bruno, Wahi, and Quinn Rivers in the north, and portions of the White River in the east, where I think conjunctive management will also play a role, but maybe more on a case-by-case basis. In terms of what may be the statewide implications for our efforts in the Humboldt River region, it's difficult to predict those implications when we really haven't yet mapped out a long-term management scheme for the Humboldt itself. That said, we're already applying the do no more harm approach to assessing new applications across the state by conducting these streamflow depletion analyses wherever warranted. This map shows the distribution and outcome of all applications that have been analyzed throughout the state. And it makes it fairly clear that the focus has been on the Humboldt River region, but we've also done multiple analyses in the Truckee and Carson River watersheds and will continue to do so as warranted. So where are we headed with respect to long-term conjunctive management within the state of Nevada? First, I think there's a real need to re-examine statewide water budgets using improved measurement tools and techniques, and particularly in light of this interconnectedness of surface water and groundwater. This falls under the category of you can't manage what you don't measure. I think we can and should improve on the information and tools we use to manage our water resource, and that includes revising the perennial yield wherever needed and appropriate. A second item falls under the category of cause no more impact or do no more harm, and encompasses the statewide evaluation of new applications and change applications for the potential to capture surface water. Following these items are really all the potential tools that may be out there and available to help either increase the water supply, decrease the demand, and or smooth out the peaks and troughs of supply and demand. And finally, and I think this probably goes without saying, whatever tools and conjunctive management practices are developed for the Humboldt will undoubtedly steer how other regions within the state will be managed as these conjunctive management issues take hold elsewhere. With that, I've finished all of my slides in my presentation, and if there's a little bit of time, I'm happy to be in person and live and take on those questions. So thanks very much.